This month, the United States, and by extension journalism, marks 45 years since the beginning of the Watergate scandal, and comparisons are being made to what's happening now in the Trump administration. Is that going too far? Or when you consider the parallels, is it just déjà vu all over again? The season finale of The Investigators starts now.
But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations.
I was going to fire Comey. There's no good time to do it, by the way.
That made me think of the Saturday Night Massacre and the firing of Archibald Cox, and that was sort of the beginning of the end for Nixon.
He is frustrated, like I am and like so many others, to see stories come out that are patently false, to see narratives that are wrong.
Now, doing our job is much more aggressive in both directions. You stand there sometimes and you're watching like a fight is going to break out.
I'm Diana Swain. We're The Investigators. This is what we do. A president at the center of a political storm, accusations of obstruction of justice, and investigative journalists unearthing stunning new details. 45 years after Watergate, it sure seems like history is repeating itself. But is it really?
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Historic words that signaled the end of Richard Nixon's presidency after a scandal largely brought to light by the work of investigative journalists.
5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
This month marks 45 years since that break-in at the Watergate Hotel, just blocks from the White House. 2 young reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, quickly connected the break-in to Richard Nixon's re-election committee. Their reporting revealed the burglars were searching the offices for something they could use to blackmail Nixon's political opponents. All of it orchestrated by Nixon's inner circle.
No charge that the president ordered the burglary, but the charge that the president ordered and aided in its cover-up.
Nixon later tried to stymie the Watergate investigation, firing an independent prosecutor and losing senior leaders of the FBI who refused to do his bidding. Shades of that playing out now in Washington.
He's a showboat. He's a grandstander.
It's a grotesque abuse of power by the President of the United States.
Former CBC journalist Don Newman covered Washington at the height of the Watergate scandal. Does he think the comparisons to today are fair? So, Don, let's start there. You were in Washington during that time. You see what's unfolding now. As people draw these comparisons, is it fair or too much in your view?
Well, it certainly reminds me of the time when I was there and Watergate was going down. There has to be criminal activity, and so far it hasn't been determined that there is criminal activity. There's craziness, but you can't impeach someone, for, I don't think, for being crazy. But it's certainly the firing of Comey, as you showed on your tape there, that made me think of the Saturday Night Massacre and the firing of Archibald Cox, and that was sort of the beginning of the end for Nixon. But the other thing that did Nixon in at the end was there were tapes that were incriminating, and there was an incriminating sentence where he was obviously trying to interrupt the investigation and delay the investigation. Or if they could get something like that on Trump, I think he'd be in trouble.
Which is interesting because Trump himself suggested that there may be some tapes in one of his tweets after he let Comey go. So who knows? We may yet see that.
Right.
Talk to me about that time. I mean, none of these things happen in a moment. They unfold over a series of months. At the time, did you appreciate that it would ever lead to Nixon stepping down?
Well, not right away, but people would say, it would be amazing if it turned out that something else had happened, and then 6 weeks later, you'd find out it had happened, and it kind of built and built and built. And near the end, I didn't see how he could hang on, but there's one other important difference. The Democrats controlled Congress, and he was a Republican. And so they were keen to investigate him, and they didn't care what was going on. They wanted to investigate him, and it turned out there were tapes and so forth. The Republicans control Congress, and they will be a lot less keen to investigate a Republican president. If after the midterm elections in 2018, the Democrats control even one house, then it'll get hot for Trump no matter what happens. But the real thing, I think, is was there any kind of criminality, or was there some kind of problem with the Russians, that he has some secret deal with the Russians, or they have something on him? unless there's, I don't think they can, as I said, impeach him for being crazy. But if he has done something with the Russians that Americans find unacceptable, then I think he's in real trouble.
I mean, given your very long, storied career covering politics, both in Washington and in Ottawa, what astonishes you most about what you're seeing unfold now in the United States?
Well, I think that there's a president who is so ill-suited for the job, and that a lot of people thought probably when they voted for him, well, you know, he's just campaigning, and politicians are always campaigning, but they're actually, when they get into office, they're much more reasonable and much more sensible. Not true. If anything, he's nuttier than he was when he was on the campaign trail, because he's got all the levers of power to play with. And the other thing is this tweeting, where he sort of, he seems to wake up in the morning, and if he had a bad night or a bad dream, he sends out these tweets which are just incomprehensible, and he's managed to alienate almost everybody that was an American friend. And he hasn't really done it to us yet, but I'm standing by. I think he might.
It's something to watch, I'll say that. And so lovely to see you. Thanks, Don.
The pleasure's been mine. Thank you.
President Trump continues to dismiss investigative journalism about his White House as fake news.
And the leaks are absolutely real. The news is fake.
He's even gone as far as calling the news media the enemy of the American people. The tense relationship between the administration and journalists regularly on display at the daily White House press briefing.
What, you're shaking your head, Peter, but that's just fake.
Trump, who's accused reporters of treating his communications staff unfairly, has even mused about canceling those briefings altogether.
What I'd love to do is stop them.
Though the tensions are high now, friction between the press and the White House is nothing new, as Barack Obama's former press secretary told us before leaving office in January.
The day that there isn't some friction between the White House press corps and the White House is the day that somebody in the press corps is not doing their job.
The CBC's Paul Hunter has covered both the Obama and Trump administrations in Washington. What differences has he noticed in what it's like to cover the White House now? So you've covered both the Obama administration and Trump in Washington. As a journalist, what's the key difference in your day-to-day experience?
At the White House, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, it's sort of unbelievable. It's like, you know, I don't go to those briefings all the time, but I go to them sometimes, and I went to them sometimes when Obama was president, because we cover a lot of the rest of America as well. But you would go, and you know, if Obama was there, it was a different story, right? It would be packed. You'd have to go early, and it's a big deal.
When he went to
when
the
he
podium
himself, which was occasional, but usually it was Josh Earnest or whoever was the person at the time. It'd be half full. You know, they'd go to your usual suspects, the ABCs, the NBCs, the CBSs, etc. And it would be a kind of back and forth, keeping in mind that it's their job not to give too much information. They're just here to make it sound like they're giving information, but not really give stuff, just to give fodder, as it were.
Now?
Now, every single time, it's like you've got to get there 30, 40 minutes ahead of time. You're not going to get a seat. You're going to stand around the edges. You stand there and you wait and you wait and you wait, and every seat fills. You can't move. If you have to go to the bathroom, forget about it.
The room is remarkably small. Like everything in television, you know, it's sort of distorted, right?
Yeah.
You get in there and it's
not much there. It's like your basement rec room, basically, full of reporters wanting to antagonize you. And then Sean Spicer comes out, and then the other big difference is the tone, right? In the previous administration, it was kind of a cordial, at times challenging, obviously, that's what reporters are there for, back and forth, but with kind of an understanding we're all kind of doing our job here. Now, doing our job is much more aggressive in both directions. It's almost like you stand there sometimes and you're watching like, well, a fight is going to break out. It's sort of weird, right? Because people are in a country that puts freedom of speech and freedom of the press and all these things. It's the First Amendment in the Constitution. It's a part of the DNA of that country. But you get the sense with Sean Spicer, how dare you ask that? What are you saying? You're implying something. Oh, you may frame it that way, but come on, punch.
You know, this is asking you to cast forward, which is, you know, a bit unfair, I admit. But do you have the sense that this level of tension and acrimony can continue? I mean, does it have a feeling of eventually it's got to burn itself out?
I don't know. You know, I think a part of it there, if I can go backwards a little bit, goes back to post 9/11, when a lot of the U.S. journalists took a lot of heat for not asking harder questions in the aftermath of that. And I think there is still a stinging feeling left over. So you want to be harder. And certainly, you know, skipping past the Obama administration, there is reason to be harder now, especially with all the stuff that is coming out of the Oval Office and the leaks and the things that people legitimately want to and ought to be asking questions about, which are awkward, for which Sean Spicer doesn't have answers. It's like, come on, these are pretty straightforward yes and no questions. But again, it's his job to kind of deflect stuff. He may not be as smooth, and the circumstances are different than they were with Obama because of the nature of the Trump presidency. But that's his job, and he'll do it as long as Trump allows him to.
Good talking to you.
Likewise.
Hostility to journalists is proving dangerous in Turkey. Anger, detention, the threat of shuttered newsrooms.
Because there is a lot of suspicion.
Neil Köksal on the challenges of finding truth in Turkey. But first, the Trump pump. TV networks have been transfixed on Donald Trump's unique handshake style for months now.
For Trump, it's a full contact sport, and he's got a few power moves.
Many of which include a yank.
That is one of his trademarks, but there's also the turnover and tap technique, which has been on full display in his recent meetings with other world leaders.
Marathon-like handshake, but just watch his expression at the end. I feel you.
One U.S. news channel even brought in an expert to analyze the Trump turnover.
That you don't have the ability to go like this.
Trump may have been catching unsuspecting world leaders off guard for months now, but not Justin Trudeau. He seemed to go to Washington prepared.
No yanks, no taps. Trudeau almost leads with his own move. We'll call it the deltoid brace.
France's newly elected president also decided to hold firm for this recent handshake.
Congratulations, great job.
Telling journalists afterward that he made sure not to give Trump the upper hand. But to anyone feeling a bit shaken after meeting the U.S. president, don't worry.
Thank you.
At least he didn't leave you hanging. Over the past few months, we've shown you some of the challenges that journalists face when they're reporting overseas. But those challenges are compounded when a country is changing as quickly and as dramatically as Turkey is right now.
It's one of Turkey's biggest problems, a division that's tearing the country apart.
Foreign journalists have long stationed themselves in Turkey's largest city, Istanbul, to report on developments inside the country.
They sense a decisive shift in Turkey's history.
It's also become a base for big stories in the region, like the war in neighboring Syria. But journalists working in Turkey, both foreign and domestic, are facing an increasingly hostile government.
That I was put on a list and I was banned from the country. And when I asked who put me on this list, they said it was the police.
Since an attempted military coup nearly a year ago, a suspicious government has turned its anger on reporters.
Are you journalists? So, excuse me. I'm here. Are you journalists?
We're, I think I'm getting...
Passport, please. Just a minute.
I think we're,
More than 100 news outlets have been shuttered, and dozens of journalists have been detained. That hostility has made Turkey a tough place to navigate, even for those who know the country well, like the CBC's Neil Köksal.
People around the world are watching what happens here very closely.
So what's she encountering now in covering the country where she was born? So nice to see you back.
Thank you for having me.
You've got family, close friends in Turkey, all of them hearing a lot of negative messages about journalists, about what you do. So how does that translate into your relationships with them?
My family and friends fortunately value great journalism. So they're more concerned about why we're going there. The thing I heard from not just my family and my safety, but the first thing they ask is, why is CBC sending you? They must know something's going to happen. That's how people think of the West in Turkey and in the region too. They think that we have knowledge that something bad is going to happen, and that's why we're sending journalists there. Even though there are many, many outlets from around the world who have been in Turkey for quite some time with dozens of journalists, not just a small bureau like we have. So that's part of the issue. The bigger issue, though, right across the board, that we talk about the word polarization. It's constantly in your mind in Turkey because people are so divided into different camps. You know, on the street, people are very friendly with each other, but people read one newspaper that tells you exactly what point of view they're coming from. Maybe they're pro-government, maybe they're anti-government, maybe they're secularists, maybe they're more religious. And it's not like here where we have, you know, a few newspapers and a few television outlets. So when you hear the volume of arrests and networks being shut down, there are hundreds of channels and hundreds of newspapers, big and small. And most of them don't follow the journalistic guidelines that we would ahead of time.
Do people just consume what reinforces their point of view then?
Absolutely.
Which is a really dangerous thing, right? I mean, it leads to hard lines.
That's right. And misinformation, false information, even when we're filing stories, we obviously look at multiple sources here, wherever we report from, but it's not the same accuracy and drive for ethics that you see across the board.
So when you first went there for CBC, came back, you're back to Turkey again. Do you see a difference? Can you feel it?
The shift is palpable. We felt it as soon as we got there, but also in the way you're treated in the street. It hasn't been the case like you saw in that CNN footage. But before, when people would ask, who are you with? We'd say, oh, we're with Canada's public broadcaster. It's similar to the BBC. Then people would get a sense of it. They'd usually talk to us. Now, especially in protest situations, when people ask, it's not in the same tone, and we have to determine whether, you know, how much information. Obviously, we're going to say we're journalists. We might say, you know, we're with a wire agency, or, you know, we might not give the network's name.
Out of self-protection.
Out of self-protection. You know, we're just there to do the story because there is a lot of suspicion, particularly since the attempted coup last summer. Also because of the message they're getting from the government, you know, about some journalists. So once that seed is planted, and we see it being planted in the United States as well, it's very hard to convince people that you are trying to really just tell a story. Reporting on a particular story, if they don't like, you know, where some journalists, they're reporting on the Kurdish issue in the southeast. Just by speaking to certain people, you could get labeled a terrorist just by trying to cover that story.
So this is where you were born. This is where your family is. Is it hard to see where Turkey is at right now?
Sure, it's difficult personally to watch, you know, this much turmoil. You know, in the first 6 months we were here, after we got there were so many bomb attacks. There was the assassination of the Russian ambassador, there's economic problems, and then living under a state of emergency, all of that. So it's disappointing because for a long time Turkey was doing really well. We tend in the West, I think, we see things in black and white sometimes for other countries. So I would caution against that, and that's how I see my role. That's why I'm glad I'm there. But in a place where things are certainly not even close to black and white, like in Turkey, the history, the nuances, how journalism has played a role in good and bad in Turkey in the past, the misconceptions about the West in Turkey, having all of that in your arsenal, I think helps tell a more fulsome story.
Thanks for this.
You're welcome.
Journalists being called by Donald Trump despicable.
From Trump to marijuana.
Weed. So we started looking at the weed. And
we've dug into a range of investigative stories this season, what these journalists have revealed about the pursuit of the truth. Next. Got a story tip for the investigators? Share it anonymously at securedrop.cbc.ca. You can also contact us through email, investigators@cbc.ca, or just say hi on Twitter @SwainDiana. And remember, you can always watch the full season of The Investigators on the CBC News YouTube channel. I'm not the only one who gets to ask questions on this program. Every week we invite you to ask me anything about investigative journalism. And this week we have a question from Crystal, who's standing by. Hi, Crystal. What would you like to know?
Hi, Diana. Thanks for taking my question. As a seasoned reporter, do you get to choose the assignments you get to report on?
As a seasoned reporter, I would say that yes, more often than not, I do now. But, you know, go back 20 years and it was a completely different story. And that's partly because journalists over time get to understand what the audience is really interested in. It's not always your personal pet issues or projects. It's got to be something broader than that. And so I think, over time, I've gotten a little bit better at figuring out what my editors want and hopefully what the audience wants. But it's not always surefire. And very recently, there was a story I was really keen on. I had to push about as hard as I ever have to try to convince the people I was working with that it was interesting. I like to think I'm pushy enough to win, but not all the time. Thanks for asking.
Great. Thanks so much, Diana.
Our goal in creating this program is to bring you closer to the work that we do as investigative journalists. And then you can edit it. Okay, I gotcha. All right. Show you what goes on behind the scenes, which issues we struggle with, how we find and confirm our stories. We've talked to reporters here and around the globe about their work, but we never imagined we'd spend so much time talking to American journalists about the man who is now their president.
I opened my mail one day and there was three pages of Donald Trump's tax return, and you're just like, this can't be true.
And that's the only gift that I've found out of his own pocket when there's supposed to be tens of millions out there.
This terrible tsunami, this virus of fake news, otherwise known as lies.
There is a big difference between campaigning for this job and campaigning for the job of president and doing the job of president.
We talked about him a lot, but he wasn't our focus. You are. And the Canadian journalists who are investigating what's happening in this country and beyond.
When we started researching this story, we thought, okay, people just need to know this.
So not only will they not show us the reports, they also won't do any interviews. So we had to find another way to piece together the puzzle.
So I realized I was going to have to go through the painstaking process of freedom of information.
Still have owners saying, hey, we can't afford to pay players because if we do, we're going to go out of business. So it just almost begs for journalists to dig into those numbers.
When we would call the mosque administration, wanting to speak to the imam, wanted to speak to elders in the community, nobody wanted to talk to us.
Journalists in the field work as a team, and so do we here. We've had fun bringing you behind the scenes every week, and we hope you've had fun watching. But now it's time for all of us to get outside and enjoy some sunshine. We'll be back in September, though, and just imagine how much we'll have to talk about by then. I'm Diana Swain. We are The Investigators.